In this lesson, we will learn how to use the CAD contours to model a terrain mesh underneath our building. Now, this is going to be the first thing that we're going to model on our entire project, and you can decide, depending on your timeline, what you want to focus on in the beginning. For example, if you want to do a simple massing model on a flat plane and show that to your client as an intermediate type of presentation, you can do that without bothering or spending time with doing things such as terrain. I do, however, when I have more time, like to start with the terrain so that I have a more accurate idea of what the building is sitting on, so that you can get a spatial understanding of how this is growing up, since you want to relate this to a real world scenario where you first would have the site and then you would build the building. So let's get started with our terrain model. The first thing that you want to do is you want to open up your layer manager, and you want to go and look at where your terrain, or at least your site model, your contour model, is located, so you can see which layer that is on. You can then go and turn off all the other layers. And at this point, you can also make a new layer for yourself that you are going to use for that 3D model, since it is a good idea not to mix any 3D objects onto your CAD layers which have this 00 prefix to them. So this is going to be called Site Mesh. And to convert this linked geometry, if you have a look under your Modify tab, you'll see that all of the CAD geometry is still linked since we used the File Link Manager, and to be able to use it for any type of modeling directly, to be able to edit these splines, you need to convert it to a editable spline object. So to do that, I'm going to make a clone by typing in Control V on my keyboard, and then you can just choose Copy and OK. And that will now be an editable spline. This you can relayer onto that new 3D layer called Site Mesh. You will then see that you still have that original linked geometry layer underneath your CAD layers, so we're just going to turn that off, and we're going to turn on our Site Mesh. So this already is going to be a copy that we can now start working with. So the first thing you want to do is you want to detach this exterior square, which is going to define the edges of our site mesh. So let's scroll down and detach that, clicking detach, and now we have our contours to work with. So what you want to do now is you want to select all of the lines, and then you're just going to start moving them up at the increment that your contours are made in. In our case, each contour represents 1 meter in height, and it is a good idea to go and check this before you start moving them up, since if they are half-meter contours, you don't want to start moving them up at 1 meter, otherwise everything will be twice as steep as it would be in reality. So just make sure that you get that incremental height correct, and if you do want, you can also go back to your CAD plans and just write down a little text label for yourself saying this is 0, this is 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., so that you can go back and confirm that each contour is at the right height, since making a mistake here would then implement or affect everything that you do on your model later on. So in our case, this first line at the bottom represents where the ocean meets the land, so that is going to be at the height of 0 above sea level. So then what I want to do is I want to move every other contour line upwards by 1 meter. So I'm choosing to do it in a way where I select everything. I'm going to move everything up by 1 meter. So I'm going to type in 1 here. I'm going to deselect this one, and I'm going to just repeat that for every single contour. And you want to just make sure that you keep deselecting them, and if you have any island contours, in other words, one that is stuck here, there's another one over here, you want to make sure that in certain cases you might have 2 lines that are actually at the same contour height. So you want to just be aware of how your contour model is formed so that you move them up to the right height. So I'm going to pause the video at this point and just finish moving them up by 1 meter, since you've seen me done the first few, and I'll then come back to this contour model once all those lines have been moved up vertically in space. So now we've finished moving up all of the individual lines, the editable splines, into their correct height, and you'll see that if I go back to the selection, I can now go and confirm by looking at the height here as being 0, 1, 2, 3 and onwards, and you can just go and basically browse through a few areas and check that that's 18, that the next one is 19, next one is 20. So this way you can just check, for example, these two contours are actually at the same height, because this one is 18, this one is 19, and so is this one. So this essentially, if it had to continue, would somehow loop back and be one continuous contour line. So sometimes you can make that mistake that you create the height at the incorrect height. So it's a good time now to just check everything, zoom around, and just have a look if that all looks correct to you. If you're happy with how it's working, then you can go across to your compound objects and then just hit the terrain button, and in one click it'll create that entire terrain for you. Now there are a couple of sub options, but I'm not really going to bother with them. I'm just going to leave it as a graded surface, and next I'm going to convert it to an editable poly, and then I'm going to select the border, and in my top view I'm just going to hit R and stretch that out, in other words scale it out, holding down the shift key so it makes a copy, or at least an extension of that border, and creates a poly that just basically creates this skirt around the entire site. But that I have done because there were certain areas that didn't cross over the outer edge of this square of ours, which is this object that we have here. So for example, all of this down here, the terrain mesh ended there, and I just needed that extension to be outside of this square that we made. So that square now is going to be used to create a mesh that we're going to conform onto our site model. Now if you create your contours really well with very good distances between the vertices, you will notice that you will have quite an okay looking site mesh, but I generally don't like the look of this multiple density mush of triangles. So I like to have a very clean site mesh to work with, since it does help the workflow much further down the line, just to get rid of this raw object that we have generated. So what you can do for yourself before you go and make any mesh that you conform onto, now I want to also go back to the CAD plans and just make sure that we have this mesh that we're going to conform onto at the right height. Now even though the C is at 0 and each contour does go up by 1 meter, I know that when we worked with our sections we didn't necessarily put the ocean at 0 on the section that we created. So I'm just going to open up the elevation and you'll see exactly what I mean once we look at that information. So here I'm going to select our elevation that we have inside our plan. I'm going to isolate it just to show you what I'm talking about. Basically our building has its datum at 0, which is this point here, but our sea level is sitting way down here. So you can go back to your CAD plans right now and measure that difference between the 0 of the real world 0 and the datum 0, which is an artificial 0 point that we're working from to gain all of our heights that we used for our slabs. So for example, if the ground floor was at 2.45 and the upper level was at 6.25, then those dimensions are measured from the artificial datum 0, not the absolute sea level 0, which is down here. So for that reason, we now need to move this entire mesh down by 17 meters so that that sea level 0 can be at -17, which is correct according to our datum 0. So this is a little bit confusing, but once you imagine it in 3D, I think it makes a lot more sense. So you can already see now by doing this that my elevation, or at least, yes, the elevation from this side is now at the same height as the actual 3D mesh that we've created here. So next thing you want to do, we can just turn off this elevation. We now need to create that mesh that we're going to drop down onto this site mesh, and that's something that I'm going to cover in the next lesson. What I just wanted to get through in this original lesson was how to create that raw contour model from your contour map in 2D. Next lesson will be about the actual meshing and the conforming of this object that we're going to drop down onto our mesh down here.